At first, it looked like the kind of photograph nobody would stop for twice. Just another stiff family portrait from the early 1900s. 5 people in formal clothes, posed in a rich parlor, trying not to move while the camera did its slow work. The father stood with one hand on a carved chair. The mother sat upright, like posture itself was part of the family reputation. 3 children were arranged around them, with that serious, practiced stillness old photographs seemed to demand. Nothing about it, at a glance, screamed mystery. But then somebody zoomed in on the mirror, and that's when the whole thing changed. In November of 2024, antique appraiser Julian Mercer was helping sort the contents of a long-sealed mansion in Pacific Heights, San Francisco. He'd done this kind of work for years. Estate sales, forgotten collections, dusty attics, full of things families swore were worthless until one careful look proved otherwise. Most days were clocks, silver, paperweights, cracked paintings, old books that smelled like mildew and old money. He was good at it because he knew how to see through dirt, damage, and boredom. He knew which objects whispered instead of shouted. That afternoon, in a cold auction warehouse near the Embarcadero, he found a stack of framed family photographs half hidden beneath moth-eaten table linens. He almost passed them by. Almost. But one image bothered him before he even understood why. It showed a wealthy family posed in what looked like their own home, maybe sometime around 1905. The furniture was expensive, the wallpaper was deep and patterned. There were bookshelves, rugs, and a large mirror hanging behind them in a heavy gilt frame. Julian picked it up, brushed away a layer of dust, and felt that little jolt people in his line of work learn to trust. Not certainty, just instinct. He bought the whole lot for less than a decent dinner. That night, back in his restoration workspace in Oakland, he set the photograph on a scanner and started doing what he always did. He checked paper type, surface wear, image depth, backing materials, all the small things that tell you whether you're holding something ordinary or something that lived through enough history to become dangerous. The print was old, likely made from a studio negative and mounted later. Yellowed, brittle at the edges, but still clear enough to pull detail if you handled it gently. When the high-resolution scan appeared on his monitor, the family sharpened first. The father was around 50, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored dark suit with a watch chain crossing his vest. He had the face of a man used to being listened to. The mother looked younger, refined, controlled, almost too calm. The children, 2 boys and a girl, stood the way children used to stand in photographs when being still mattered more than being comfortable. Everything about them suggested money, order, and presentation. Then Julian moved to the background. And there it was. In the mirror behind the family, faint but unmistakable, was a figure standing in the doorway behind the photographer. Not part of the portrait, not part of the family. A 6th person. The shape was half lost in shadow, but not lost enough. There was a body, a stance, a line of shoulder and arm. And in that person's hands, angled downward but clearly present, was a long, dark object that did not belong in any family portrait. Julian stared at the screen, then leaned in so hard he nearly touched the monitor. It looked like a rifle. That's the moment the image stopped being interesting and started becoming unsettling, because the family wasn't reacting to it. Nobody in the portrait looked alarmed. Nobody was turning. Nobody seemed aware there was someone in the background at all. Which meant one of 2 things. Either the figure had slipped into the doorway without being noticed during the long exposure, or that person had every reason to be there and was somehow still being kept out of the official frame. Neither option felt good. Julian spent the next 3 hours testing the image from every angle he could. Contrast adjustment, shadow recovery, edge enhancement, tonal separation. He'd done this kind of work for years, estate sales, forgotten collections, dusty attics full of things families swore were worthless until one careful look proved otherwise. It held shape too consistently. The outline stayed where it should stay. The dark object reflected light in a way surface scratches didn't. The figure was real enough to make his stomach tighten. He turned over the backing and started carefully removing the paper seal. Old frames sometimes carry the only useful truth left in a case. Studio stamps, dates, handwritten names. Bits of context people don't think matter until a century passes and they're all you have. Under the brittle backing board, in faded ink, he found a note. Halbrook Residence, January 28, 1905. Below that, written in different handwriting and with shakier pressure, were 6 words that made the room go very still. 5 weeks before his death. Julian read it twice, then a third time. Now the photograph had a clock attached to it. He went straight to newspaper archives. It didn't take long. San Francisco papers from March 1905 carried the story in scattered little bursts, the way old murders often arrive to us now, not as living drama, but as clipped blocks of surviving print. Edward Halbrook, merchant, importer, property holder, found dead in his study, shot once in the chest, no forced entry, no clear suspect, investigation ongoing, reward offered. Then the trail grew thin. There were follow-up pieces for a few weeks, a mention of police interviews, a vague line about business tensions. Then the story began to slip out of public attention. And when the city was devastated the following year by the great earthquake and fires, whatever momentum the case had left seems to have been swallowed whole. Records vanished, offices burned, private papers scattered. Like a lot of things in old cities, the truth didn't exactly disappear. It just got buried under louder disasters. Julian could have stopped there. A creepy image, an old murder, a likely dead end. Most people would have taken the thrill and moved on. But the Mirror had him now. The next morning he went to the History Center at the San Francisco Public Library. If there's one thing that can still outlive a fire, it's the stubbornness of archives rebuilt by people who don't like letting the past vanish cleanly. He found city directories, probate records, family listings, society columns, old property maps, the little bones of a life. Edward Halbrook had lived in Pacific Heights with his wife Josephine and their 3 children. He owned part of a shipping and import concern with another man named Walter Mercer. The house had been sold a few years later. Josephine moved across the bay to Alameda after the earthquake. One son joined the army years later. The daughter married into another Bay Area family. The youngest faded in and out of the record the way younger children often do. Then Julian found a donated family collection, papers given to the library in the late 1980s by a granddaughter. Letters, receipts, a few personal notes. Nothing dramatic at first. Then one letter dated just days after the photograph had been taken. Josephine wrote to her sister that Edward had become tense and distracted. He was receiving late-night visitors. He had argued with someone behind closed doors. He refused to explain the matter fully, only saying that certain business accounts had become unsafe. She wrote that the house no longer felt peaceful. There was a sentence in the letter that Julian copied twice because it landed with such quiet force. "I feel as though we are being watched even in our own rooms." That line does something to you when you've already seen the Mirror. Another letter, written after Edward's death, was worse. Josephine described the police searching the house, the study window open, the questions repeating without answers. She said the detectives believed Edward had admitted his killer willingly, which suggested he knew whoever came to see him. That narrowed the world fast. Business associates, family friends, trusted men. Julian kept digging. The oldest son, writing years later to an uncle, mentioned something the police either missed or never pursued far enough. Edward had been fighting with his business partner, Walter Mercer, through the winter of 1904 into 1905. There were accusations of altered shipping manifests, money that didn't reconcile, inventory that existed on paper but not in storage. Edward had reportedly gathered documents to prove it. Documents that disappeared the night he died. That kind of detail changes a mystery. It gives the fear a shape. Now Julian had motive. He had a dead merchant, missing records, a partner with a reason to panic, and a mirror reflection showing an unknown man with what looked very much like a firearm standing behind the photographer only weeks before the murder. Not proof. Not yet. But enough to start feeling the edges of a real story. He tracked Walter Mercer through surviving business pages and social notices. After Edward's death, Walter did something that looked harmless on paper and rotten in context. He left San Francisco not long after the city's catastrophe and re-established himself in Tacoma, where he did very well for himself. New company, new standing, new reputation. He died comfortably, respected, and publicly untroubled by the questions left behind in California. That by itself proves nothing, but it sure doesn't make a man look cleaner. Julian called an old friend, Sam Ortega, a retired homicide investigator who had a weakness for impossible old cases. They met in a quiet cafe where the windows looked out on grey water and passing traffic. Julian laid out the scan, the letters, the newspaper clippings, the timeline. Sam didn't say much at first. He just studied the mirror. Then he tapped the screen. "This person isn't drifting through the frame," he said. "Look at the body line. They're planted. They're watching. That matters." In early 20th century photography, exposure times were slow enough that accidental movement often blurred into useless haze, but a person standing still in a doorway could absolutely register. And if the long object in the reflection really was a rifle, then whoever held it had chosen a very strange moment and a very dangerous position from which to observe a family portrait. Sam's theory was simple and ugly. "Maybe this wasn't the murder attempt," he said. "Maybe it was rehearsal, intimidation, surveillance. Let the man know he can be reached in his own house." Julian hated how much sense that made. He kept going. Through genealogy forums and public records, he contacted a descendant of Josephine's side of the family, pulling one family's buried fear out of the margins and placing it where people could finally see it. Months later, the photograph went on display in a small historical exhibition about hidden evidence in early imagery. Visitors crowded around the enlarged mirror detail more than the main portrait. "That's how these things work, I guess." She said, "Mirrors remember what people try not to see." It sounded like superstition when Ellen first heard it as a child. Just one of those eerie phrases old relatives say when grief has had too many decades to harden into ritual. But now, with Julian's scan open between them, it no longer sounded poetic. It sounded literal. Ellen told him the family always suspected Walter Mercer, not because they had courtroom evidence, but because the pieces fit too neatly. Edward had confronted him. Edward had gathered records. Edward died. The records vanished. Walter slipped into a new life. And Josephine, according to family stories, never trusted reflected rooms again. She covered mirrors during storms, turned family portraits to the wall after sundown, refused to have new ones taken in front of glass. Grief does strange things. So does fear when it never gets resolution. Julian wanted more than family suspicion, so he took the image to a forensic photography specialist at Berkeley, Dr. Leah Sloan. She was careful, skeptical, and exactly the kind of person you want looking at something like this, because she had no interest in being impressed. She had interest in being right. After studying the scan, she gave him the sort of answer historians live on and hate at the same time. The reflected object, she said, was highly consistent with a long gun of the period. The figure's proportions were measurable enough to compare against known photographs of Walter Mercer. And the body match was plausible, even strong, but not conclusive in the way modern criminal standards would demand. Too much image loss, too much distortion from reflection and age. Enough to support a serious historical argument, not enough to convict a ghost. Still, when you stacked that beside the letters, the timeline, the missing documents, and Walter's convenient disappearance into a cleaner life, the shape of the truth became hard to ignore. Not courtroom truth, story truth, historical truth. The kind that arrives late and incomplete, but arrives anyway. Julian compiled everything into a report and passed it along to archivists, historians, and eventually a cold case liaison who agreed the material deserved preservation even if prosecution was impossible and long irrelevant in legal terms. What mattered now was not punishment. That window had closed a century ago. What mattered was correction, restoring the record. pulling one family's buried fear out of the margins and placing it where people could finally see it. Months later, the photograph went on display in a small historical exhibition about hidden evidence in early imagery. Visitors crowded around the enlarged mirror detail more than the main portrait. That's how these things work, I guess. The official subject gets dethroned by the accidental truth. People leaned in and squinted at the figure in the doorway. Some looked skeptical at first. Then the shape resolved for them and their faces changed. That's always the moment with a photograph like this. First you see a family. Then you see that they were not alone. And once you see it, you can't go back to the innocent version. Edward Holbrook, in that frozen room, still has no living voice. Josephine never got the clean justice she deserved. The children carried a murder through the rest of their lives with no verdict to place around it. Walter Mercer, if he was the man in the mirror or the man behind the murder, died under a respectable name in another city. Real life is cruel that way. Sometimes the wrong man gets the long ending, but not the final one, because more than a century later, that family portrait began saying something it had been trying to say all along, not loudly, not neatly, just there in the background, trapped in silver and paper, waiting for somebody patient enough to enlarge the right corner. That's what gets me about old photographs. We think they preserve what people meant to show: the dress, the furniture, the status, the family pose, the respectable surface. But sometimes the real story slips in sideways. A reflection, a shadow, a doorway nobody bothered to question because the room itself seemed ordinary. Until it didn't. And that's the part that lingers. Not just that a mirror may have captured the only surviving glimpse of a man connected to a killing, but that the evidence sat there for generations, in plain sight, invisible only because nobody had looked hard enough yet. So the next time you see one of those old portraits, the kind with stern faces and polished rooms and everybody trying to look like history is under control, it might be worth remembering this. Sometimes the family isn't the whole picture. Sometimes the truth is standing behind them.